Right in the middle of my son's wedding, he stood before me and screamed, "Get out! My wife does not accept your presence here." I turned around and walked away without a word. The next morning, he called me, "Mom, I need the keys to the farm." I took a deep breath and replied with 4 words, "I'm glad you're here." If you're watching this video, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're listening from. I'm Margaret, 59 years old, living on the outskirts of Bozeman, Montana. My whole life has been tied to this farm, waking before dawn, checking the fences, feeding the horses, always keeping the farm keys in the pocket of my jacket. This afternoon, I traded that jacket for a pale blue dress and a thin scarf. I was going to my son Ethan's wedding. When I arrived at the decorated venue, I stopped in front of the memory table. A neat line of photo frames stood there, filled with pre-wedding shots, Ethan grinning wide, Olivia leaning her cheek against his. I searched for myself somewhere among them. Nothing. Every photo looked polished and perfect, without the woman who'd raised the boy in those pictures for 20 years. I straightened my back. The pale blue dress wasn't flashy. I chose it because Robert, my late husband, used to say I looked best in it. I brushed my fingers along the edge of a frame, then stepped aside to let others take pictures. Olivia appeared from behind me, the faint scent of woodsy perfume trailing with her, her smile polite but thin. "Today is our day," she said softly, her tone edged like a blade. "I know," I replied, calm, no explanation needed. A bridesmaid passed by, clutching a bouquet of white flowers. She tilted her head and murmured, "Could you step back a bit, ma'am? It'll look cleaner in the photo." I nodded, stepped back to the edge of the tent, giving the camera a clear view. Ethan was posing with the bride's family. He glanced my way just a flicker, then looked back toward the photographer's lens. The event coordinator came up, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, could you sign the receipt for the flower arrangement by the entrance?" "It's listed under the groom's side," he said. I took the pen. The sponsor's name was already printed, Olivia's family name. I looked up. He gave a practiced, service smile. "Happens sometimes, misprints. I just need your signature to close the file." I signed, my name tucked neatly beneath the name of a family that wasn't mine. Then I thanked him and slipped away to the narrow path behind the tent, where the makeshift kitchen sat hidden behind tarps. I just needed a breath, just one. When I returned, Olivia stood close beside Ethan, saying something quick and sharp. They left their group and walked straight toward me. Her heels sank slightly into the grass, but her pace didn't falter. "Mom, we need to talk," Ethan began, voice tight, controlled. I looked him in the eye. "All right." Olivia's gaze traveled from my dress to my scarf, stopping at the brooch on my chest. "Your outfit is a little attention-grabbing." She paused just long enough for the word to sting. "If you think it's inappropriate," I said evenly, "I can go home and change." Ethan's face shifted, as if he'd just received a silent signal. "That's not necessary," he said. "You should leave." I said nothing. The air fractured into thin, sharp layers. I noticed the shoulder of a waiter tense as he turned a tray of glasses. Everything seemed to freeze midair. Then Ethan turned fully toward me, as if something behind him had pushed him forward. His voice broke loose, loud, clear, final. "Get out. My wife doesn't want you here." I felt my lips go dry before I even understood where the words had struck. Each syllable hit straight into my chest. For a heartbeat, everything compressed, the music cut off, the smell of wine burst in the air, the lights flared like needles. I couldn't hear my blood rushing, only the silence, the hollow space opening between me and the son who once told me he loved me every day. Cameras flashed like a swarm of insects hitting the lights. The edge of my scarf flicked up and fell again, simple and final as a verdict. I wanted to ask him why, but my throat locked tight, as if filled with ash. In my mind, an image appeared out of place. Ethan's tiny hand, sweaty from fever, clinging to my shoulder. That memory tore apart under the sound of whispered laughter. I stood straight. If I faltered, they'd see it. I wouldn't let them. No one stepped forward. No one intervened. They all stood back, watching as if it were a scene in a play, waiting for the next act. I gave a small nod, not in agreement, but to sever the cord tightening around my neck. The sound of my own swallow echoed too loud in my ears. I turned away. The rows of linen-covered tables stretched out like an endless thin sheet of ice. Each step felt like a blade nicking my heels. I walked past the neatly stacked chairs, past the guests who froze mid-gossip, past the cloying sweetness of wedding flowers. My back burned hot, my face was ice cold. Outside, the parking lot wind hit my skin, Montana, cold, raw, honest, fair. It did its job, offering no comfort, no apology. I opened the car door. On the passenger seat sat the wrapped gift I'd brought for Ethan. I'd planned to tell him, "Take this something that knows when to fold." Now, looking at it, I realized there are things I'd folded too late. A trust, a habit of calling before deciding, an illusion that a wedding would still be a safe place for a mother. My chest tightened, like someone pressing a stone against it. I kept my hand on the steering wheel until the warmth crept back into my skin. I needed something solid to hold on to. The phone buzzed. Ethan. His name lit up like an unnecessary flash. Buzz, stop, buzz. I didn't pick up. I watched until the screen went dark, then let it stay that way. This wasn't revenge. It was simply keeping one pain from spreading any further. I buckled my seatbelt. The parking lot gleamed white under the lights, cars lined up like props after a performance. I turned the wheel. In the rearview mirror, the wedding tent shrank, the music came back on as if nothing had happened, applause rippling again. I saw myself walking out of a picture already framed, and that frame, suddenly, no longer had a place for me. The road back to the farm felt shorter, or maybe I'd stopped counting. Turning onto the dirt path, I slowed so the wild turkeys wouldn't startle. The crunch of gravel under the tires brought back another night, the night Robert died, when I drove home alone and realized there were doors only I would ever open again. The iron gate appeared. I stepped out. My hand was steady. The key slid in. The click sounded clean, like an answer. Inside the hallway, I placed the gift box on the wooden shelf beside Robert's old hat. I didn't turn on all the lights. The warm glow from the kitchen was enough to bring the house back into focus. I set the key ring on the table. The metal against the wood sounded like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. I sat down, my hand resting on the keys, letting the coolness draw out the last of the heat in me. I thought of the hours I'd stood in the rain fixing fences so Ethan could make his camping trip, of the dollars I'd saved from milk deliveries to pay his dorm fees, all of it leading to that single sentence today. I took a deep breath. Didn't cry. Tears don't fix rotten wood. I learned that from Robert. When wood groans, don't soothe it, replace it. So I will replace what needs replacing. The lock on my trust, the latch on my study door, the way I answer the phone. I tilted my head, listening. The house was breathing. It was still here. I was still here. And the keys were still under my hand. Early the next morning, the kitchen was cold and quiet, the kind of quiet Montana has after a night of wind. I turned on the kettle, poured coffee grounds into the filter, and let the boiling water run through. Steam rose thick and brown. On the shelf sat a photo of Robert, wearing his canvas hat, tin cup in hand, eyes squinting against the sundae. The phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the name before picking up. "This is Mom." Ethan's voice was flat, businesslike, like reading from a schedule. "I need the farm keys. We're starting renovations, converting the space for better use. There's a client interested. Cash flow will be steady." I heard the faint sound of papers shuffling on the other end. Then Olivia's voice slipped in, soft but precise. "The sooner, the better. The investor's schedule is tight." I set my cup down and asked directly, "Where are you two planning to live?" "In the city," Ethan said, without a hint of hesitation. "It's more convenient for work and commuting." I leaned against the counter, watching the fog outside fade where the sunlight touched. "Have you really thought this through?" "I have," Ethan said, breathing for the first time in the call. "Leaving the farm unused is wasteful. Upgrading it means you won't have to work so hard anymore. Everyone benefits." I took a breath, steadying it in my chest, and let out 4 quiet words. "The farm's not for sale." There was a pause, just a few seconds, but it felt like a radio signal slipping out of tune. When Ethan spoke again, his voice had hardened, like reading the terms of a contract. "I have rights." "You have partial ownership," I said slowly, evenly. "The management rights are mine." A short laugh came from the other end, not Ethan's. Olivia spoke, crisp and polite. "No one's taking your place, but if the land just sits there, it loses value. The market doesn't wait for anyone." "I'm not chasing that," I said. "This house doesn't open its doors to strangers' schedules." "Well, think about it," Ethan concluded, his tone closing like an email. "I'll call back." The line went dead. I picked up my cup, took a sip. The coffee tasted more bitter than usual. I opened the drawer, took out a small key, and unlocked the corner cabinet. Inside was a metal box. I pulled out an old yellow envelope with Robert's handwriting in the corner. For Margaret, when needed. The seal had been broken years ago, but I'd only ever read the first lines before putting it away. Today, I unfolded the paper and reread the part he'd underlined. Grant full management rights to Margaret for life. Any transfer shall occur only when the holder is ready. Transfer condition. The recipient must understand the land's worth beyond its price. Below it was Robert's firm signature and the date he notarized it at the law office. I pressed my palm flat on the wooden table to steady my hand. Robert always planned an exit route for those left behind. He never liked big words or arguments. He preferred leaving knots tied just tight enough that no one could pull them apart under pressure. I folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and locked the metal box. In my mind, I could hear the morning radio jingling to life. I turned the dial to the local station. The announcer's voice came steady. Breaking news: several farms around the Bridger Range are being converted into luxury resorts. Land prices are climbing fast. Investment groups advise landowners to seize the opportunity. I turned it off. I opened another drawer, pulled out my black leather notebook, and wrote at the top, to-do list. One by one, I listed: back up all documents, deposit originals in the bank's safe, schedule a full medical checkup, update contact with Mr. Whitaker. Then I added, do not argue over the phone. The phone buzzed again. Ethan's message: Mom, you're overreacting. I didn't reply. For a second, I remembered how he used to call me in the middle of the night during college, asking how to make tomato sauce because he missed dinner at home. That feeling pricked, then faded. I let the phone stay silent. On the wall near the kitchen door hung a small wooden board with Mr. Whitaker's number. I dialed. His secretary answered briskly. Whitaker Law Office, good morning. This is Margaret, I said. I need to update Robert's will and schedule the earliest appointment. He still has the original copy, she said. Would tomorrow at 11 work? I'll be there. I hung up, turned the radio back on, but switched it to a music station. The phone lit up again. A message from Ethan. I just want to help you. I typed, erased, typed again. Helping isn't the same as taking everything apart. In the end, I didn't send it. Then the phone buzzed once more, another message. I thought it was Ethan. It wasn't. It was Olivia. Maybe you misunderstood us. How about dinner tomorrow night? Just the three of us. A reconciliation dinner? I started with the smallest tasks to keep my hands from shaking, wiping the silverware with a soft cloth, laying each piece on the white table runner, turning every glass so the rims faced the same direction. The oven filled the kitchen with the smell of flour and cinnamon. The apple pie murmured inside, while the pot of pumpkin soup simmered low on the stove. The kitchen light glowed warm and calm, soft enough to hide the sense that I was setting the table for an exam. A car stopped outside. I wiped my hands and opened the door. Ethan stood on the top step, white shirt buttoned all the way, shoulders tight. Behind him was Olivia, in a dark, long coat, her wood-scented perfume sliding through the air like a cool trace. Hi, Mom, Ethan said quietly. Come in, I said, stepping aside. Olivia smiled with perfect politeness. It's so warm in here. Your old-fashioned style has such character. She spoke without letting her eyes settle on anything for more than a heartbeat, as if scanning a room she might need to describe later. The pie just came out, Ethan said, softening at the smell. You still make it exactly the way you did when I was in high school. I kept the recipe because it works, I replied, motioning them to the table. The plates, spoons, and napkins were already waiting. Ethan pulled out a chair. Olivia sat across from me, placing her phone face down, though her fingers still brushed its edge out of habit. We stuck to safe topics: the weather, the early frost closing the mountain pass, Ethan's work schedule. He spoke briefly about a new project in the city, lots of travel, good prospects. Olivia slipped in, her tone purely informational. Our partners love natural spaces. This place would be perfect for corporate retreats if organized right. I ladled soup into 3 bowls, setting one before each of us. What are you two planning to do with the stables? I asked. Turn them into an outdoor event space. Olivia answered without hesitation. Rustic but flexible. String lights, wood flooring, replace the big doors with glass, keep the old beams for authenticity. Ethan sipped his soup, eyes down. I set my spoon down, neatly. A stable is a stable. The horses still live there. Olivia smiled, like explaining something to a museum visitor. It wouldn't affect that if designed properly. You can keep the character and still improve functionality. Win, win. I didn't ask further. The main course went by with only the sound of utensils tapping plates, each of us listening to our own silence. Ethan mentioned his company was moving offices. Olivia admired the old porcelain bowls, said they were perfectly matched and hard to find a complete set like that in the city. I acknowledged it, offered no compliment back. "I'll get the vanilla ice cream," Ethan said, standing up, looking around for something tangible to do. "In the freezer," I said. He opened the fridge slowly, unhurried. "I'll touch up my makeup," Olivia said suddenly, picking up her phone, "so I look decent in photos." She said it like someone expecting a camera. Ethan sat back down, exhaling. "The soup's really good," he said. "Reminds me of when Dad and I used to go fishing. I remember how you always asked for more salt," I said. A rare silence followed, long enough for his eyes to lose their guarded look. Then they drifted away again. I stood. "I'll bring dessert." In the kitchen, I pulled the apple pie from the oven, cut 3 even slices, added scoops of ice cream to each plate. As I stepped back into the hall, I noticed the bathroom door was open. The light was off. No sound of running water. I tilted my head, listened. A thin line of light leaked through the crack at the end of the hallway, the office door. I knew I'd locked it. My heart skipped 2 close beats. I walked straight toward it, setting the dessert tray on the small shelf by the wall so my hands were free. My fingers brushed the keyring beneath my sweater reflex. The door was open just enough to show the desk lamp glowing inside. I pushed the door. Olivia stood by the wooden desk, phone held chest high. On the desk were several file folders. One drawer was slightly open, a corner of white paper showing. The lamplight caught her skin. She startled, but only for a blink, then smiled almost instantly. "This room's been closed since my husband passed," I said, each word landing steady. Olivia lowered her phone, placing it flat on the desk. "I just love antiques," she said. "I thought I'd take a look. I'm sorry." The apology was perfectly shaped. "I don't keep a display," I replied, eyes fixed on the drawer. She picked up her phone, slid it into her coat pocket. "The pie's probably getting cold," she said lightly, brushing past me toward the dining room. The woodsy perfume drifted by again. I stayed behind, alone with the lamp and the half-open drawer. Using one finger, I pushed it shut carefully so the papers stayed exactly as they were. Then I flipped the switch, turning off the light. Before leaving, I glanced at the bookshelf. Everything still stood in its line. I carried the dessert tray back to the dining room as if nothing had happened. Olivia was already seated. Ethan held his spoon, smiling faintly. "Smells amazing," he said. I set the plates before them, sat down, cut a small piece of pie for myself. Everything continued as planned. Compliments about the dessert, questions about the recipe, small talk about the weather. Everyone's facial muscles did their job. When they left, I stood by the door and said the bare minimum: "Drive safe." Olivia gave me a short hug, the distance marked by the width of her coat's shoulders. Ethan touched my arm lightly, then withdrew. Their headlights swept across the wooden fence before disappearing down the dirt road. I closed the door. The house returned to its kind of quiet. I hung my coat on the chair and went straight to the office. I unlocked the door, turned on the desk lamp. The desk was spotless, the pen at its angle, the paperclip in place. I pulled open the second drawer, on the right tax files, third drawer repair receipts, everything exactly as I'd left it. I reached up to the shelf for the brown folder, where I always kept a thin yellow envelope pressed flat between 2 covers. I opened it. No familiar thickness. I flipped again. Still flat. I set the folder on the desk, turned each page carefully. No envelope. I stood perfectly still. The wooden chair behind me creaked once when I pulled my hand back too fast. I opened another drawer, checked the stacks, lifting them gently, methodically, as if repairing an old machine. Nothing. The thin yellow envelope was gone. Everything else was in perfect order, maybe even neater than before. Someone had touched these things wearing gloves. I placed both hands on top of the filing cabinet and bent slightly, just enough so my knees wouldn't buckle. The feeling of intrusion wasn't loud. It was like realizing one of your shirt buttons had been replaced without you noticing. I straightened up, turned off the light, pulled out the key, checked the lock, and slid the extra bolt into place. The wind whipped against the porch roof like someone tapping rhythm with a dry branch. I sat in the kitchen, under the dull yellow light, hands wrapped around a cup of warm water gone cold. The whole house seemed to lean in and listen. Then the gate bell rang, one sharp, dry sound that made me look up. Hardly anyone visits at this hour. I put on my coat, grabbed the key ring, switched on the porch light, and stepped outside. Through the thin fog, I saw a dark pickup truck with its headlights off. The gate creaked open with its familiar sound. Whitaker stepped in, long coat, holding a thick envelope stamped with an embossed seal. He nodded. "Sorry to come late. I needed to show you this right away." I stepped aside, letting him in. He followed me to the kitchen, placed the envelope on the wooden table, and sat down like someone who knew the chair well. I didn't ask questions. He took out a letter opener, sliced the edge, and pulled out a stack of papers inside a clear plastic sleeve. The corner bore his office's red seal. "A certified copy," he said. "A handwritten letter from Robert, written many years ago." I looked at the seal, then at Robert's name, printed on the cover like handwriting still warm. Whitaker turned the first page and rotated it toward me. Robert's writing was uneven, but firm. I read every line, word for word. In the letter, he wrote about a father he once met at the hospital. The man had an only son and a daughter-in-law who spoke beautifully. They had convinced him to sign a power of attorney just to make things easier, and soon sold the house, moving him into a care facility where no one called him by his name anymore. Robert met him in the waiting room, the man holding a cheap hat, eyes empty, as if he'd fallen out of his own life. Robert wrote, "I came home, opened the door, looked around, and wondered if one day I'm no longer here, what could keep you safe from other people's hands?" He said that because of that man, he went to see a lawyer and had the papers drawn up, giving me full lifetime management rights. He wrote clearly, "It's not that I don't trust our son. I'm afraid the world will push him." The last lines were underlined. Whoever wants to change things can only do so when the one holding the rights nods. Without that nod, everything is just wind. I placed my hand on the edge of the page and stayed still for a beat. My breathing found its rhythm again. Whitaker said nothing while I read. When I folded the papers, he spoke. "I've kept this copy in my office since that day. The original, as you know, was filed with the will and estate documents. But after the recent call from your daughter-in-law, I thought you should see the full content again." I slid my cup of water toward him. He shook his head. "I'll be going soon," he said. "Just 4 things, short and clear, so you stay ahead." He raised one finger. 1. You have the legal right to continue managing the property for life, exactly as Robert arranged. That right is valid and indisputable. A second finger. 2. Any changes regarding use or transfer must have your written consent. Without it, nothing moves forward. A third finger. 3. They may go after your reputation or your state of mind. They might spread talk that you're losing clarity, try to force medical evaluations on their terms. He paused, meeting my eyes. So do it first. Schedule a full medical checkup, get it certified, keep the original. No legal jargon needed. A doctor's note is enough. Then the fourth finger. 4. Keep all critical documents in a bank vault. You can leave a copy at home, but the original should be somewhere with cameras and security, and install a gate alarm. Porch lights don't stop people who lack shame. I nodded, jotting quick notes into my notebook. "One more thing, not legal," he added. "Don't argue over the phone. Talk in person, or let me handle it." I closed the notebook. The sound of the pen against paper felt like a latch sliding shut. I told him about the missing yellow envelope from tonight. He listened without interrupting. Finally, he asked, "Do you recall anyone else knowing where you kept it?" I shook my head. "Then let the court handle that part," he said. "Don't go looking on your own." He stood, gathered the documents, and left a certified copy for me. "Don't keep it in an easy drawer," he said. "Lock it in your home safe for now. Bring it to the bank first thing in the morning." He turned up his collar and glanced at his watch. "Sorry for the hour." I walked him to the gate. When I turned the key behind him, he looked back once and added quietly, "You're not alone. The groundwork's already laid. If they push, we change footing." I held the key ring in my hand, leaned back against the chair. The metal pressed into my palm along a familiar line like a map I've known all my life. Outside, the wind kept on, but the night no longer felt like something that could slip through every crack it wanted. I must have fallen asleep without noticing, my hand refusing to unclench. In a drifting dream, I saw Robert standing by the stable door, hands in his pockets, saying nothing, just giving a single nod. Enough. By noon the next day, the heat shimmered over the asphalt, making it ripple like waves of steam. I got a text from Olivia, just as I was standing at the bank counter. "Can we meet alone? Just women talking." I read it again, slipped my phone into my pocket. If we were going to meet, I wanted somewhere public, neutral, easy to leave. I texted her the location, a roadside diner off the highway, the kind where truck drivers stopped for coffee and pie. The place was just loud enough spoons clinking against cups, the espresso machine hissing, the radio tuned to a sports channel, a few men in baseball caps talking about hunting season. I chose a table by the window, my back to the wall. The waitress brought a pot of dark coffee, rich and sharp. I hadn't poured a cup yet when the door opened. Olivia walked in light tan coat, sunglasses perched on her hair. She scanned the room like she was taking its measure, then spotted me. "This place is rustic," she said, sitting down across from me. "The coffee smells strong." "I picked somewhere we can hear each other," I said, pouring half a cup. She nodded, removing her gloves and folding them neatly on the edge of the table, every movement precise, nothing wasted. "Ethan's under a lot of pressure lately," she began. "Work piling up, the house plans, the wedding barely behind us. I think we should find a balance that eases things for him." "What kind of balance?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "You live alone on that big farm," she said plainly, looking straight at me. "Who takes care of you if you get sick? The winters are harsh, the roads close off. If something happens, you know what I mean." I stirred my coffee slowly. The bitter scent rose sharp in my nose. "What is it you want? Say it clearly." Olivia smiled, like she'd been waiting for that cue. "A simple plan. We turn the farm into a luxury countryside retreat, just a modest number of rooms, keeping the ranch aesthetic. You move into town, a comfortable apartment, medical care nearby. You'll have a steady income every month and won't have to do anything." "Won't have to do anything," I repeated. "Exactly," she nodded firmly, lowering her voice like sharing a secret. "We already have a construction team, media partners, and corporate clients lined up. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. Just hand over the operational rights. Full access keys, contracts, guests, inspections, all of it. That's the short version." The waitress set a glass of iced tea in front of her. The cubes clicked softly. Olivia stirred it with a plastic spoon, eyes never leaving mine. She seemed confident the sweetness of partnership would be enough. I set my cup down. "You need the keys, and full control." "Yes," Olivia said without flinching. "Without that, it's impossible to work with contractors and clients. Timing is everything right now." I looked out the window. A few muddy pickup trucks were parked out front. People moved in and out, the rhythm of habit unbroken. And habit, well, that's something money can't buy. "You have a clear goal," I said. "So here's my clear answer." She put down her spoon, waiting. "No lease, no sale, no partnership like that." Olivia leaned back, smiling thinly. "You're holding your son back." "I'm keeping my husband's word." "Robert's gone," she shot back, then caught herself halfway. "I mean, times have changed. We should be flexible." "I've been flexible for years," I said, "so my son could make his own choices. The rest isn't for sale." "You know that." Olivia straightened, her tone losing its sugar. "The court will look at the family's best interest. You can keep your feelings, but someone has to think about value." "Go ahead and think," I said calmly. "I've done my part." She nodded slowly, as if making a mental note. "I'll cover this meal," she said, reaching for the check. I stopped it with 2 fingers, pulled it toward me, and set down my share. "I'll pay for mine." She glanced at the money, then at me, her smile returning to polite formality. I stood first. "If the day comes when money wins," I said, "I'll still choose to keep what's left." I spoke clearly enough that I could hear it echo back to myself. Outside, the sunlight burned hot on my hands. I unlocked my truck door. The phone vibrated, Whitaker calling. I answered immediately. "Do you have a moment to talk?" he asked. "I'm in the diner parking lot. Go ahead." "They just filed a petition," he said briskly, "requesting the court to reassess the property's value." Their argument will be underutilization. We'll respond exactly as planned. I'll send the schedule and documentation requirements by email. I understand. Did you get any rest last night? Enough to answer clearly this morning. I opened the door, climbed in, keeping the phone on speaker. On the other end, he exhaled like a man checking the last item off a list. As always, don't argue with them over the phone. All communication goes through me. See you tomorrow afternoon at the office. I'll be there. I hung up and looked in the rearview mirror. Through the glass, Olivia stepped out of the diner, phone pressed to her ear, lips moving. The sunlight glinted across her face like a thin coat of gold. I started the engine. The sound of it, steady and familiar, pushed her image clean out of the frame. The mailman arrived while I was sweeping the porch. He parked his bike by the gate and handed me a thick document envelope. On the corner was the name of a city law firm, and below it, in small print, representing Ethan and Olivia. At the kitchen table, I slid open the flap. The papers slid out, smelling faintly of fresh ink. It was a court petition requesting an evaluation of asset distribution. The language was concise and cold. The farm was not being utilized effectively, its value stagnant, and they asked the court to appoint an assessment of my mental capacity. The words didn't need to be loud, they struck precisely at the softest spot of a person living alone in old age. I set the papers down, poured half a glass of water, drank it in one go, and called Mr. Whitaker's office. That afternoon, I sat in his small conference room. The window faced the parking lot, sunlight slanting across the floor. He spread the pages across the table in neat piles, speaking slowly, as if tracing a map. They're asking for 3 things, he said. 1. An independent appraisal of the property. 2. A medical and cognitive evaluation of your condition. 3. A review by the court to consider dividing the estate if it determines the property isn't being managed efficiently. He looked up, probably knowing I didn't need him to explain the terminology. We'll respond with 3 lines of defense, he continued. Exactly what we planned. I can handle that, I said. He gathered the papers, clipped them back into a folder. I've scheduled the evaluation with the clinic the court typically uses. As for the appraisal, we won't contest it. Numbers are just numbers. They don't define how deeply you love or hate a piece of land. They just set the framework for the conversation. That night, I blocked off 2 days on my calendar for the hospital visit. The next morning, I arrived early at the internal medicine department, walking through hallways that smelled of disinfectant. The nurse asked standard questions. I answered smoothly. The doctor gave me a simple memory test. Repeat 3 words. Draw a clock, read a short passage, and summarize it. I didn't try to appear sharper or softer than I was. The rest was routine blood pressure, eye exam, reflex check. When it was done, the doctor told me to return in 2 days for the certification. His tone was friendly, not pitying. I thanked him and exhaled deeply once I reached the parking lot. Back at the farm, I did what I always do, used my hands so my mind wouldn't wander. I photographed every part of the property, the main house, stables, granary, fencing. I noted the date and angle for each shot. Then I pulled out the filing cabinet, organizing maintenance receipts by year, stapling them together, roof repairs, porch planks replaced, the gate repainted, each slipped into a labeled folder marked maintenance. Before dusk, I drove to the bank and requested another safety deposit box. The metal tray was cold. I placed inside the original deed, tax papers, and a certified copy of Robert's letter. I closed the lid, slid the door shut, turned the lock. The mechanism clicked clean, solid like a hammer striking a stake into the ground. I signed the ledger and took home the receipt and the list of everything I'd stored there. Back home, I changed the lock on my office door. 10 minutes of work, but it felt like pulling out a splinter. That night, the phone vibrated. A message from Ethan. If you cooperate, this all goes smoothly. I stood by the window, my reflection merging with the glass. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my legal notebook, wrote down the exact time, took a screenshot, and closed it. If needed, everything would have its proper timestamp. The next day, I received an envelope from the clinic. Inside was a single sheet, black print on white paper, physical and cognitive health stable, fully competent to make independent decisions. No flourishes, no extra words. I scanned it, sent a copy to Mr. Whitaker, kept the original in my home file, and placed another in the bank vault. On the way back, I stopped at the hardware store to buy a simple gate alarm, then called a local electrician to install it later that afternoon. The landline rang. Hardly anyone calls that number anymore except a few old friends. The screen read, "Unknown." I picked up. There was a 1-second silence, then a woman's voice drawn out slightly at the end of her words, leaving a message like throwing a stone at a wall. "Don't cling to scrap metal." Then the line went dead, sharp and dry. I set the receiver down and sat still. Dinner wasn't started, but I didn't feel hungry. I turned off the kitchen lights, leaving only the porch lamp on. Outside, the wind brushed against the new gate bell, making a thin, trembling sound like metal trying to comfort itself. I walked through the living room, resting a hand on the back of Robert's old chair, opened the window just a crack to let the night air in. Whoever thought this was just scrap metal had no idea how heavy it feels in the hands of the one who must hold it. I closed the window, checked the locks all around. Tomorrow would bring more papers and a bit more work for my hands. Not too much, not too little, just enough to keep standing longer than the wind. The courthouse that morning smelled of old wood and new disinfectant. I arrived early, wearing a dark sweater, the file folder held tightly against my chest. Inside the courtroom, the benches creaked softly as people sat down. Olivia entered first tailored coat, hair neatly tied, heels that made no sound. Ethan followed a step behind, moving carefully, like someone just learning how to walk in a crowded room. I looked once, then lowered my eyes to the wooden table. The clock bell rang. Judge Collins emerged, black robe, voice low and steady. Everyone stood. Then Saturday. The opposing attorney spoke first, his tone practiced, almost theatrical. He described the farm as underutilized, its value frozen, market opportunities being neglected to the detriment of other heirs. He ended by requesting a medical and cognitive evaluation of me, citing my age and solitary living conditions, which may impair sound judgment. I listened to every word without interruption. Olivia kept her gaze fixed on the judge's bench, never looking my way. Ethan stared down at his hands. Then it was our turn. Mr. Whitaker stood, placing 3 folders on the table, like bricks laid neatly in place. He spoke slowly, deliberately, pausing just enough for the stenographer's pen to keep up. "Your Honor," he began, "this is the most recent medical certification confirming that Mrs. Margaret is healthy, lucid, and fully capable of making her own decisions. Here is the maintenance record for the property tax receipts, photographs of its current condition. And here," he lifted the 3rd folder, "is the handwritten letter from Mr. Robert, duly certified and filed with the will, explicitly granting Mrs. Margaret lifetime management rights." He turned slightly toward the other side. "We do not oppose an independent appraisal. Numbers should be clear. But we do oppose any attempt to revoke management authority without legal or factual basis." Judge Collins made a few notes, pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, and looked at me. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, "I have 3 questions. Please answer briefly." "I'm listening, Your Honor." "First, do you have a plan for the property's use?" "I maintain the farm for family purposes," I said. "The stables remain stables, the land remains land. I host periodic school visits for local children. I have no intention of turning it into a noisy version of a resort." He nodded, shuffled the papers. "Second, have you obstructed Mr. Ethan's legal rights to his inheritance?" "No," I replied. "He holds his ownership share. I manage the property under the authority of my late husband's will. I haven't touched his inheritance." "Third, do you consent to an independent medical evaluation appointed by the court?" "I do." He set his pen down and looked from one side of the room to the other. "Very well. The court acknowledges these statements. The request to revoke management rights is denied at this time. The court authorizes an objective appraisal by an independent evaluator mutually agreed upon by both parties. Mrs. Margaret will undergo an independent medical assessment as scheduled by the court. And one more thing, neither party is to exert personal pressure outside of legal proceedings. I don't want to hear about threatening calls or text messages. Clear?" The phrase, "Yes, Your Honor," rose from several voices at once, uneven in tone. Mr. Whitaker gave me a small nod, his hand brushing the edge of the folder like a final punctuation mark. The opposing attorney gathered his papers quickly, efficient but not hostile. Olivia kept her posture straight, her lips pressed together. Ethan looked toward the courtroom door, as if waiting for someone to call his name. The hearing ended with the scraping of chairs and the soft rhythm of shoes across the floor. I stepped into the hallway, shoulders brushing others unintentionally. The air outside the courtroom felt thinner but colder. Ethan stood a few feet away, hands in pockets, glancing at me for a brief second. Something hovered in his throat but never came out. Olivia touched his arm lightly. "Let's go," she said, just loud enough for me to hear. They walked off quickly, back straight, without turning around. I leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. On the bulletin board beside me, the schedule of upcoming hearings was taped in layers, sheets overlapping like shingles. The crack in this family wasn't on paper. It ran beneath our feet, an underground line you could feel even when the floor seemed flat. I lifted the file to my chest and made myself walk away. That courtroom, I thought, was like a locked stable. The sounds inside, footsteps, breathing, still belonged to something restless. But the hardest creature to contain wasn't anyone else. It was me. I drove out of the lot, leaving behind the echoes of underutilized and frozen value. The road home was straight, and I already knew what tonight's work would be: photocopying the latest inventory list and filing it with the court documents. Boundaries don't need to be painted in bright colors. Sometimes, they're drawn with a single sheet of paper at exactly the right time. Winter arrived without warning. When I opened the door that morning, the yard was white as if someone had sifted flour over everything. The fence darkened in the fog, the wood creaked and tightened with the cold. In town, every cafe was buzzing with one story. Olivia had been seen having dinner with a real estate developer from the city at a restaurant with wine served by the glass and thick linen tablecloths. A friend sent me a blurry photo taken through a window, Olivia leaning in, smiling, her hand resting on the man's wrist. I turned the screen off immediately and put the phone in a drawer. Out here, my work stayed the same. Boil water, check the frozen tank, scatter feed for the chickens, clear the path from the house to the stables. I didn't add words to a story already swollen with too many. Near midnight, the wind howled against the corners of the house. My phone vibrated, insistent. Ethan's name glowed on the screen. I answered, "I'm here." His voice broke partly from the cold, partly from something sharper. "Mom, I need to see you, now." I asked where. "The supermarket parking lot," he said. "By the garden section." I grabbed my coat, shoved the keyring into my pocket, and pulled on my leather gloves. The road to town gleamed like glass. The tires gripped hard. The headlights carved a white tunnel through the snow. Ethan stood under a yellow street lamp, barehanded, eyes red. When I stopped the car, he climbed in, slamming the door behind him. The cold rushed in with him, then the cabin fell silent except for the sound of his uneven breathing. He started, then swallowed hard. "She hasn't been home for 3 days. I thought it was a business trip. Today the bank called about unusual activity. Our joint account, it's empty. I didn't say I know or I've heard." I reached into the glove compartment and handed him a packet of tissues. He wiped his face, fingers trembling. "I called." She turned her phone off. "A friend sent pictures. He stared through the windshield, as if something had just flown past. "I don't have anywhere to stay, Mom." "At work. My boss told me to take some time off." They didn't say fired, but I heard it anyway. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, resisting the old instinct to reach over and touch his shoulder. "Come home," I said. "Stay for a few days." He didn't nod or shake his head, just exhaled, the way someone does when finally setting down a heavy weight. I started the engine and turned the car around. On the way back, he spoke little. I heard enough to piece the story together. Promises of a new project, dinners with major investors, a string of transactions he'd signed off on out of the kind of trust people give to the person they share a bed with. He didn't say her name, not to protect her because he couldn't. By dawn, the wind paused long enough for the snow to fall freely. I parked in front of the porch, turned off the engine, unlocked the door, and switched on the lights. "Come in," I said, hanging up his coat and handing him one of Robert's old jackets. "Wash up. I'll warm some soup." There was still chicken soup from the night before. I reheated it, added ginger and fried shallots. Ethan sat at the end of the table, holding the mug of warm water I'd given him. "Aren't you going to ask why I did it?" he said hoarsely. "I don't need a story," I replied. "I need the truth just enough to handle what comes next. Eat, then sleep." He ate not fast, not slow like a man remembering his mouth still knew how to work. When he finished, I cleared the bowl and helped him settle on the living room couch, tucking the heavy wool blanket across his shoulders. I turned off most of the lights, leaving only the glow from the fireplace. Before I left the room, he murmured, "Thank you, Mom." I didn't respond. Gratitude, right now, landed on the floor like a grain of salt. I left it there. The next morning, the wind shifted, slicing cold in a straight line. I let him sleep an hour longer, then touched the back of the couch. "Up," I said. "Come help me." He rose out of habit, still groggy, but quick to put his boots on. I handed him a pair of thick gloves. "Stables first," I said, "then breakfast." Outside, the snow cracked underfoot, thin, dry. The stable carried the animal's warmth, the smell of hay mixed with damp leather. I gave him a shovel. I took a rake. We worked like laborers, not like mother and son cleaning out stalls, spreading fresh straw, checking the trough, breaking ice from the pipes. The wind sliced across our faces, our breath turned white. He bent over the first hay bale wrong, nearly straining his back. "Lift from the knees," I said. He adjusted, did it right. No more words were needed. When the last horse was brushed, its coat gleaming, he leaned against the wooden wall, steam rising from his collar. "It's been a long time since I've done this," he said, not as a complaint, just a fact. I nodded, took out my phone, and snapped a picture of the newly wind-proofed roof. "For the repairman," I said. He watched me adjust the focus, his eyes softened slightly. By the end of the day, Ethan lay curled on the couch, back against the cushions. I sat across from him, the key ring resting on the table. "What's your plan for tomorrow?" I asked. "I have to move out of the apartment this week," he said. "They want the lease cleared early since it's under my name, and He stopped. "Work told me to take a month off. After that, I don't know." "Stay here as long as you need," I said. "But if you stay, you work. There's always enough to go around." He nodded, eyes fixed on the rug. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said, voice steady, like reading a test result. "I just need a place where I don't have to lie anymore." I didn't answer. I stood, turned off the overhead lights, and left only the soft glow of the hearth lamp. When I looked back, he was already asleep, breathing evenly, his face no longer tightened by the cold. Outside, snow fell again fine, unbroken. I stood in the dark, watching my son sleep. The tip of my shoe nudged the table leg, just enough for the keys to chime softly together. I whispered, barely loud enough for myself to hear, "In this house, there's only work and truth." Then I walked to the window, drew the curtain open another inch, letting the white sky spill into the room. Outside, the wind kept doing its work, and come morning, we would do ours. Spring doesn't arrive like someone flipping a switch. It melts in slowly, like watching a field shed its layers of clothing one by one. Every morning, I woke Ethan before the sun passed the peak of the stables. He carried a brown notebook, a pen tucked in its spine, following me along the eastern fence line. I showed him where the wood had softened. "If it gives under your thumb, replace it. If the wire sagged, tighten it. If a nail rusted, pull it." He recorded each task, each post number I had marked before. On the southern field, we spread fertilizer evenly, careful not to heap too much in one place. When we came back, Ethan opened his notebook, crossed out what was done, drew arrows for what would carry over to tomorrow. I told him, "Don't write to make it look neat. Write so you'll know where to return." He nodded, no smile, but less night in his eyes. Inside the house, I placed a glass jar beside the stove, taped a label on it, "Impulse Buys." Whenever he wanted something that wasn't on the list, he had to write it on a slip of paper, fold it, drop it in. Only after 7 days could he open it and decide if he still needed it. Most of those slips didn't survive a week. I taught him how to sort expenses, necessary repairs, routine maintenance, basic provisions, emergency reserve. The for fun budget only came after those 3 were covered. No short-term loans. No, buy now, think later. He sat with me at the table, comparing old receipts to new ones, finally understanding why replacing one plank at the right time costs far less than rebuilding the whole frame after rot spreads. We made a small chart for the fridge. 3 columns: task, person responsible, date checked. When the pen struck through the box marked "done," the sound was like a breath falling back into rhythm. I called the elementary school principal in town and proposed a farm day for the kids. She remembered me. "The children love horses," she said, But the parents will want clear safety rules. I emailed her a list: approved areas, fence, distance rules, feeding time, and hand-washing stations. That weekend, local families arrived on schedule. I stood at the gate handing out name tags. Ethan led the group around the western field. He told the kids to keep their palms flat when feeding the horses, fingers tucked in so the teeth wouldn't catch. A boy asked, "What does the land need to stay green?" Ethan answered, simply, "It needs someone to look at it every day." A girl with a high ponytail plucked a few blades of grass. Ethan told her not to pull them out randomly, then showed her where to trim right at the marked line. From a distance, I heard children's laughter mixing with the jingle of tack straps, and the house seemed to fill with cleaner air. One afternoon, Ethan and I sat waiting in Mr. Whitaker's office. He placed a new stack of papers in front of me and explained in 2 steady sentences. This was a revision to the will, tight enough to hold, gentle enough to stand. I read it carefully. The main clause: when I pass, the farm will go to Ethan if he maintains and preserves the land for 10 consecutive years. No selling, no mortgaging, no turning it into a noisy commercial venture. With an annual summary report sent to the law office. If he fails or violates it, the property transfers to Robert Jr. once he reaches adulthood. I signed where the markers indicated. My hand didn't shake. Mr. Whitaker asked Ethan if he had any questions. He shook his head. His expression didn't change, but his shoulders dropped like a man accepting a weight that finally matched his strength. On the drive home, he said, "It feels like both an opportunity and a leash." I replied, "A good leash keeps you from falling." When it came time for Olivia's visit, I arranged nothing except leaving the gate open at the right hour. She drove in, Robert Jr. in the back seat, wearing a knit hat with a fox on it. Olivia was polite, distant, careful with her words. "I'm bringing him right on schedule," she said, her eyes glinting like polished glass that reflected nothing. I nodded and called Ethan. He came out, crouched to the boy's height, held out his hand. "All right, little horseman," he teased, pointing to the bundle of hay waiting nearby. Robert Jr. ran through the barn, giggling as the hay brushed his chin. Ethan showed him how to twist and tie the dry grass into a small bundle with twine, each knot taut slowly, letting the small hands learn how much pull was enough. I watched Olivia standing off to the side, twisting a ring that no longer sat on her ring finger. She leaned against a wooden post for a second, then straightened. When it was time to leave, she said goodbye, in a voice soft as silk string, but one that touched no one. I didn't touch her with words either. That evening, the only sound in the kitchen was Ethan's pen scratching lightly across paper. He'd spread out his brown notebook, drawing a yearly plan divided into 4 seasons, columns for each task. "I'm thinking of planting a windbreak along the northern edge," he said, tapping his pen. "The east trough needs replacing, it freezes fast in winter." He looked up. "1 education day for the school each month. Open the farm to local families every 2 weeks. In summer, plant a strip of wildflowers to help the bees." When he finished, I said only, "Write it down. Do each thing completely." He smiled a little, just enough, and kept writing, adding exact dates. When he finally set the pen down, the notebook was full of small, tidy boxes, like a blueprint for the house's water lines. I looked at his hand pressed against the paper and noticed, for the first time, his nails were cut the way working hands are. Late that night, I brought out 2 cups of tea and set one in front of him. Ethan closed his notebook and looked up. "If I get another chance," he said, "I'll keep it." He didn't say it like a vow, more like a line from a manual, something to remember and carry out. I nodded, gathered the loose papers so their edges aligned, and turned off most of the lights. The kitchen grew smaller, warmer, clearer. The harvest festival unfolded like a long exhale after 10 months of holding one's breath. Flags hung along the rows of lights on the square, and the local band played tunes easy for feet to follow. Steam rose from the pie stalls, children darted by with bags of buttered popcorn, and a few old men in baseball caps stood in clusters, already talking about the coming snow season. I set up our booth at the edge of the walkway, glass bottles of milk, jars of fruit preserves, and a hand-painted wooden sign that read, "Farm Education Day, open monthly." Ethan tightened the last 2 bolts holding the sign's legs in place, looked up and asked, "Is it straight?" I checked and nodded. He wiped his hands on a cloth and let out a breath, the kind people make when something small but solid is finally done. The visitors were quiet and kind. A young mother asked how to keep milk from picking up refrigerator odors. An old man sampled the jam and rewarded me with a story about a drought from years ago. I listened, answered briefly, and handed out slips with next month's schedule. On the stage, the MC called up each farm family to share a few words about their season. When it was Ethan's turn, he stepped onto the wooden riser, holding the microphone with both hands. From below, I saw his fingers steady. "We still do things the old way," Ethan said, his voice low but clear. "This land is used as it is. We open our gates for school visits, so children can see where grass grows, how a horse eats, how a fence gets checked. We're not turning it into a noisy attraction. If anyone wants a pretty picture, go ahead and take it. If anyone wants to know how to keep land from getting tired, come on Education Day. I promise only what I can actually do." He paused, glancing toward the front row where a few teachers raised their hands. "That's what we can promise." The applause wasn't loud, but it was steady and sincere. A few older folks nodded, the way people do when they recognize something true. The city's police chief leaned over to whisper to the man beside him, then looked toward me and raised his hand in greeting. I returned it with a small nod. When Ethan stepped down, he passed me and said simply, "One part's done." I answered, "Now for the part that gets us home." The afternoon slid by quickly. By closing time, we packed up the booth, counted the jars, and noted the number of milk bottles sold. I let Ethan keep the ledger, watched him write the numbers carefully, and add the totals by hand, no calculator. The road back to the farm opened between rows of yellowing trees. Night rose. Stars filled the sky like pins pressed into black fabric. The fireplace waited to be lit, but I didn't go inside right away. Instead, I went to the barn, turned on the porch light, and called Ethan over. I slipped a hand into my coat pocket and pulled out a spare key to the main storage shed. It didn't shine much, just a small piece of metal still warm from being carried close to my body. I placed it in his hand. His palm was warm and dry. "This isn't everything," I said. "This is today's share of responsibility." Ethan didn't pocket it immediately. He stood still, looking at the key longer than necessary, as if reading a map. "I know," he said. "I'll hang it where it belongs." We went into the shed together. The tool hooks lined the entrance, iron darkened by years of touch. Ethan slipped the key onto the same hook, letting it rest beside the plow handle, the bolt cutter, the flashlight. He didn't hide it in his pocket. The sound of metal touching metal was small, but it carried weight. We made a full round, the stables quiet, doors latched with 2 turns, water pump off, valves tight, lights shut in the right order. In this house, order is the rope that keeps everything standing. When we stepped back outside, the night wind carried the scent of hay and a trace of pine from the forest's edge. On the porch, I pulled a chair close and sat down, my hand resting on the wood rail. Ethan sat one step below, silent. In that silence, I heard the thin chirp of insects, the wood expanding with the leftover warmth, and an owl shifting branches somewhere out in the dark. My heartbeat slowed, cooling like iron dipped in water. I thought about the road behind us, the woman thrown out of a wedding, the missing envelope, the sharp words over the phone, the winter wind that cut like knives, the folder that once fell open in the courthouse lot, underlining the phrase, "Relocation of the family cemetery." Those things now rested quietly in the locked files, not because they'd disappeared, but because they'd been named, placed, and handled by work and by time. I turned to Ethan. "On open days, talk less," I told him. "Let your hands show. People remember with their eyes longer than with their ears." "Yes," he said. "I noticed when I brush the horses slowly, the kids stand still. When I talk too much, they look out at the pasture." "The land doesn't like loud voices," I said. "It likes people who know how to move slow." A truck passed on the dirt road, its headlights sweeping across the fence before vanishing. Ethan stood and pulled the porch door to, keeping out the draft. "I'll check the gate locks," he said. I nodded. He walked out, his shadow stretching long, pausing at the gate for a moment before returning. "All good," he reported. Since the day he came back, the word "good" had shifted less temporary, more steady. I sat a while longer, the scent of dry grass seeping through my coat. Here, justice doesn't arrive with sirens or chains. It comes through endurance, rising every morning against the wind, locking every door each night, replacing a termite-eaten board before it spreads, opening the farm once a month, so children can see something that can't be sold. Forgiveness isn't erasing, it's drawing boundaries. The one who failed stands on one side, the work to be done on the other. The bridge between them is labor crossed, one step at a time. Legacy isn't written on paper boasting wealth. It lives in discipline, like the key hanging on the tool rack, visible to everyone, reminding us that to keep is an active verb. I rose and went inside. The kitchen table was tidy. The ledger sat neatly beneath the light. I touched the main key ring that hung around my neck, metal cool against my skin. I closed the door, hearing the latch click into place. I knew I'd hold those keys for many more days, not out of fear, but because I knew whose hands were ready. Out on the porch, Ethan was switching off the last light. He looked up, met my eyes, and smiled small, certain. In my mind, a promise took shape, as clear as the white lines painted on a summer road. When my son is truly ready, his hands won't tremble opening any door. I turned off the porch light. The night folded closed like a notebook bent to its proper edge. The wind kept moving across the fields, through the trees, tapping the eaves in a slow rhythm. Inside, the wall clock ticked evenly. This story doesn't end with fireworks. It ends with the sound of a key resting where it belongs and a house sleeping in conditional peace. The story you just heard is a work of fiction, but every breath that woman took, every time she tightened her grip on that ring of keys, echoed something truer than words could ever capture. Sometimes, to hold on to justice, you have to give up peace, not through shouting, but through the quiet endurance of discipline, responsibility, and faith in what's right. Names and details have been changed to protect the identities of those who might be recognized. We don't tell this story to glorify resistance, but to remind you that there are mothers, seemingly ordinary people, who've kept a home standing not through money or power, but through steadiness and work-worn hands. If you've ever been called cold simply because you dared to draw a boundary, because you dared to protect what's right, remember, that's not cruelty, that's dignity. And if you believe that justice isn't found in the crowd's judgment, but in the quiet moment when a door closes exactly where it should, share this video. Someone out there may need a reason to stand up, to hold on to what's right, to learn how to stay calm in the wind. Don't forget to subscribe, because here, every story is a quiet, precise dissection. We cut through lies, remove weakness, and stitch trust back together, so the heart can learn to beat steady again, not out of hatred, but out of truth. On the final screen, we leave you with 2 more stories about people who lost everything just to keep the one thing that can't be bought: dignity. Trust me, you won't just watch them. You'll feel every heartbeat in your chest.